Well, welcome to a presentation that I have actually thought about for many years. How can I share in a way that's meaningful to other people that will actually bless and help them on their journey? And my story, I'm going to tell you, I didn't ever think that I would have to stop eating wheat. So I'm going to begin just by saying a little prayer before I continue with all of you. Heavenly Father, it's always a challenge to understand why we suffer, and sometimes there's a medical reason. It takes time to discover, and as we go through the journey, I pray that everyone hearing this would make the necessary changes that might improve their health as well. And I thank you for the light that you give each one of us. Help us to grow in your light and to be transformed by every experience that you're giving us. Give us courage, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. So, years ago, I began in the 1980s to work with a friend in a bakery. And it was a health food bakery, and it was part of the Country Life vegetarian restaurant that was in Manhattan. And our little bakery was in Peekskill or Putnam County, New York. And we had to bake, I don't even remember. We got up at 7 or 6 every morning and started the bakery and baked hundreds of loaves of bread because the restaurant served 500 customers a day. And we had bread like Heidelberg rye and freshly made, sprouted wheat breads and wheat with oats. And so there was my beginning, seeing that bread was the staff of life. And when I'm giving bread to the world, I'm giving a part of God's message of love and health and healing. And so I began with that thought about bread. So later on in life, I had my children. Of course, I got married and I had my children. I have 2 daughters. And I raised them with a vegetarian diet that I was really happy I had learned about. It was not always easy to be a full vegetarian, and the family I'd married into, they were Italian. And the Italian culture, love, food is love, and if they give you a meal, you eat it. You don't say, oh, I don't eat chicken or I don't eat that. So that was always a challenge to try to be a vegetarian and be polite about it, try to explain why. But I stuck to it. I'd been reading the Councils on Diets and Foods by Ellen White. And I thought, wasn't she so brilliant to be writing back in that day and time about how the earth would be full of pollution in the last days and how that pollution would affect the animals. Therefore, we shouldn't really be eating them, and that God had an abundant supply of plant-based foods, right? All right. So I was loving cooking too. I used to give cooking schools at my church, and I still might, but I loved, teaching people how to make entrees. And we even had a song called Fiber Come Back. It was a great song that Jennifer Jill wrote that we'd do a cooking school together sometimes, and we'd be singing, Fiber come back, we want something to chew. Fiber come back, and that something is you. Fiber come back, on roughage we will dine. Fiber come back, you're rough, but that's just fine. So part of our message was that our bodies clearly needed the right amount of fiber. And then we'd have a healthy colon. Perhaps we'd never get colon cancer because we'd keep ourselves so healthy. So I was doing cooking schools, and I was raising my children to be complete vegetarians. And I was making gluten steak even. When I did, they'd dance for joy. Hey, mom's making gluten patties. We love them. And the neighbors would be like, what are they? They always thought whatever our house was having was quite different than what they had, which was, hot dogs, hamburgers, peanut butter and jelly. And here I was making tofu cutlets and gluten steaks. So I was already peculiar, but I was really believing that this diet I was living on was blessing my family and blessing those who wanted to hear it in my cooking schools and make healthy changes. So now we're going to fast forward. That was the beginning. Then my children grew up and I had to take care of my aging parents. My father had Parkinson's. My mother had all kinds of issues with her health and ended up in a nursing home after 3 months of me caring for her. And the reason I mention that is sometimes a major stress can come into your life and it can bring up the genetic marker for a gluten allergy. And it's not really an allergy, but we call it that for convenience sake. It's an autoimmune response that your body is having to gluten. But I didn't think my body had any trouble with gluten until the stress of caring for my parents. First, I had my mom and I had to care for her. Then my father sailed up from Florida and I had to really help him take care of living on his boat in his final years. He lived on a sailboat. So this was all quite challenging, but I'm like, I can do anything through Christ. I can do all things. But I was grieving and stressed, and the grief and the stress, and also an empty nest. My children had now moved on and they'd moved out. And all those changes caused me to have stomach pain that was unbelievably hard. I couldn't even swallow water without feeling like I'd swallowed swords. Something weird was going on. I couldn't eat a banana. I was getting thinner and thinner and no food was working. I couldn't figure out what it was. And at that time, it was the year 2005. In 2005, I was getting too thin. And some women like that. But for me, I was bony and thin and not thriving. And I said, something is really wrong here. What can I do? And of course, I prayed about it, but I would be doubled over in pain. So I finally put myself into the emergency room and said, I'm not leaving until you can help me. Find out what's wrong with me. And after 13 hours, they really didn't know what was wrong with me. They suspected I was precancerous, but they never actually found any cancer. So what was wrong with me? Well, I had a friend. Thank God for this wonderful friend. He has been in a wheelchair since he was 20. So at that point, he'd been in that wheelchair for 48, 50 years. And he worked in a hospital in Boston to help other people who had spinal cord injuries. And he knew all the doctors. And he made friends with everyone in that hospital. In fact, they dedicated a room to him. They named it the Charlie Croteau therapy room. So because of his influence in this hospital, he said, I'm going to take you into the Boston Medical Center hospital, and I'm going to hook you up with a gastroenterologist. She's really great, and maybe they can help you. So I went in with him, and I saw a doctor there, a gastroenterologist, who said, the first thing she said are there any stresses in your life? And I said, well, besides the fact that, my father is living here, my mother just died, my father's boat sank at the dock, my children have grown up and they're out of the house and they're having troubles in their college life. But aside from that, isn't that normal? Isn't that like life, normal stuff? She looked at me and she said, maybe. And then she said, however, I want to test you for celiac sprue. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, well, that's an autoimmune issue that can come up through your genetics? And has anybody in your family ever had this, or this problem? And as she asked me, I realized, my grandfather died of stomach cancer. And I learned later that if stomach cancer, if celiac is not noted and seen in time and properly diagnosed, then it can turn into a cancer, a stomach cancer. So I suddenly realized that, genetically, I probably got this from him, my grandpa. Okay. So then she did the test, and in 1 week, wow, she knew what I had. Now, I had spent a year trying to get doctors to look at me, and they did an ultrasound and said, "Oh, you have a bonny pancreas." Wow, what's that mean? A beautiful pancreas? But I can't eat food and I'm sick. What's wrong? It took a year of local doctors finding nothing. Back in 2005, they didn't have enough awareness, actually, of celiac. A few special doctors did. But here I am in 1 week with the right doctor finding out exactly what I have. And I had to go in and have the biopsies. I had to have an upper endoscopy of my small intestine, and then a colonoscopy. And Charlie drove me in, so I didn't even have anesthesia. I just did it so that he could drive me home and not wait for me to wake up, because I might not wake up that fast. So that, I don't recommend that. I think going to sleep when you're having it is better. But anyway, so that was the beginning of a new chapter for me, of hope for healing, a hope that I wouldn't have pain all the time every time I ate, because I actually thought I was going to die. I said, this is going to be a very slow and painful way to die, because I can't eat food. And I can't, and when I figured out that it was gluten, thank God it was a light through the tunnel, and maybe my body would heal. Even though I wasn't a spring chicken anymore, I wasn't a young girl, I was older, maybe my body would rejuvenate and I would be able to absorb the nutrients that we need to get from food. And there was a time when I had a sense of humor about it and thought, well, God, maybe I'm going to eat manna and that will be the next food on my plate. And that would be great, because these other foods down here on earth, they're not working for me. But I didn't get literal manna. I had to navigate. And so I'm going to go through some of the things quickly. I have about 13 slides to show you that I would like you to take a look at as I was learning and reading. I had wonderful books to read, but here's some thoughts that I pulled together on celiac. Open up the slides. Yeah, keep calm. That's important, because your emotions are affected with what we eat. Some people do this emotional eating. And when you have to absolutely change your diet, at first it's a little challenging. So stay calm as you make these challenges. Make it an adventure and try to make it pleasant and fun and have a grateful heart. But again, there's a difference here on this slide between celiac sprue and gluten sensitivity. There are a lot of people that are gluten sensitive. They can still eat a certain amount of gluten, but they cannot, when they reach a certain threshold, they get symptoms: diarrhea, pain, bloating, gas, stomach distress. And so you might find out that you're not a celiac, but you still have trouble with gluten. And that can be very common. For me, as I've told you, it's not really an allergy, it's a genetic trait. And for me, it was passed on through my grandfather. And eventually my father got tested and had a marker that showed that he had a celiac issue too. But at his age, he refused to go gluten-free. He just wasn't ready to do that. But a lot of times people will diagnose you, your primary care will say you have irritable bowel syndrome. That's what my doctor said first, and gave me protonics and medicines to just cover the problem, and it never got to the root of the problem. So, yeah, and many celiac people are thin, but they're thin for the wrong reason. They're not getting the nutrients that their body actually needs. And yes, you can have other autoimmune disorders, and in my case, I had other autoimmune disorders that I don't need to discuss in detail here, but I also ended up having Lyme disease. So I don't know if the two are related, but I did have a tick bite turned into Lyme disease. And I kind of wonder if the one thing led to the other, but I won't know fully. There's no clear light on that. So, next slide. So, here's the Red Cross did a test on their blood samples. They looked at their blood samples and they found that 1 in 133 people in the United States probably have celiac disease. And that's 3 million people. So we now treat celiac disease more seriously than we did in 2005. It was very difficult to be a gluten-free person. It was hard to find bread at the beginning of my journey. It was the most horrible tasting millet bread that sunk like a stone, and it didn't work in a sandwich. It just crumbled and fell apart. And I thought, well, why bother eating bread? I just won't eat bread anymore at all because we can't make a good bread. But living like that among other people is very challenging. You go out to eat with your friends and you try to order a gluten-free meal and they bring you a plate of rice that has semolina noodles in it, a rice pilaf and you say to them, I'm sorry, this has gluten in it. And they say, oh, we give it to all our people who want a gluten-free diet. So even the people in the restaurant needed to be trained on what a gluten-free diet is. And some people have to be as strict as me and some people don't. And that became challenging. But the world today, I would say, is more aware, more friendly, more, if you do go out to eat and try to get a gluten-free meal today, it's so much easier in some areas, and especially in Italy. If you go out to eat in Italy and you say, I need a gluten-free plate, please, they make the whole table gluten-free. They have really good gluten-free pasta. And they say, oh, yeah, everyone's dish here is going to be gluten-free. And no one minds. So because eating is such a sharing, universal thing, especially for the Italians, they just have you all share in the same gluten-free meal. And I think that's really quite nice and quite thoughtful. So let's check out the next slide. So this is what happens. The normal lining, your villi are nice and tall, and they're like little fingers, and they absorb your nutrients. But if you have celiac, it's flattened like this. And so the nutrients don't go into your system, and yet you have pain. And when you're eating, you feel inflammation. And I certainly had terrific pain. Some people don't. Some people don't have that stomach pain. They have skin issues or other autoimmune issues, and it can turn out that it's actually from gluten. Because remember, this is a very silent thing that comes on slowly over time. All right, next slide. So we know 1/3 of the population carries the gene that's associated with celiac, but that can be activated at any time. So all my life, I ate wheat and worked in a bakery and did all these things and seemingly had no problem until it was activated. So it's a very good thing to be tested regularly. Ask your doctor to give you the tests for celiac. Okay, next. And so on this slide, we're just looking at, what happened with the wheat. And that would be a whole nother story. So I'm going to just give you a nutshell overview that the people that hybridized the wheat made a shorter variety. So the wheat today is not the same as the wheat that we had 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the wheat grew tall and it lived out its lifespan fully. Right now, we're growing a shorter wheat. We're harvesting it when it's somewhat still green. So it's another issue. It's not really a celiac issue. There's problems with the wheat that we're growing today, especially here in America. Okay, next. So this is one of the problems. It's not the only one, but the pre-harvest application of this herbicide, Roundup, or other herbicides, they contain this ingredient called glyphosate, and they put it on as a desiccant. And it was suggested as early as 1980. It has since become routine over the past 15 years, and it's used as a drying agent 7 to 10 days before harvest. And like I said, sometimes they harvest it before it's fully developed. According to Stephanie Sneff of MIT, who studied the issue in depth and who I recently saw, and it goes on, the eating non-organic wheat crops with glyphosate just before harvest came into vogue late in the 1990s. So most of the non-organic wheat is now contaminated. So if you're going to have wheat, I suggest it be organic. Next. And this is a picture of fresh organic bread. Doesn't that look lovely? And it really is the kind of bread I used to make in the bakery. So you who do not have celiac, you can still make wonderful bread, but I would suggest you would only use organic wheat and know where it comes from. Okay, next. So when you find out that you really cannot have gluten, people sometimes say, well, can you have spelt? Can you have Ezekiel bread? And the answer to you, if you're a celiac, is no. No, you really have to be very, very strict. So all these grains are wheat based, have gluten in them, and I put a little note on this page that there's also some amount of trace gluten in oats. So I buy a gluten-free oat. Bob's Red Mill has a gluten-free oats, and those seem to work fine for me. There are people that were so sick from having celiac that they cannot even have oats, but I seem fine with it. I make a wonderful oat burger patty, and I'm really thankful that I can have oats. So that's just a little side thing that you have to know if oats work for you, but the gluten-free are the best. Okay, next slide. So here's some gluten-free grains. And, this is a picture of all the possible grains. When you find out that you have to go gluten-free, does that mean you'll never, ever have starchy greens ever again? And or do we really want a paleo diet that says, no more grains, or other diet fads that say take out grain entirely? I haven't been led that way. I think that God still has an abundance, and we just have to know which grains we can experiment with. So in this picture, I'm going to guess what I'm looking at is there's buckwheat, and that's a wonderful grain. There's millet and rice, amaranth, teff flour, coconut flour. I cook with almond flour. And we mix our grains with some lighter things like tapioca or potato starch or potato flour, because that just makes it lighter and not so heavy. And it's an experiment, but I make, for my husband, I make crepes almost every Sunday morning. It's his favorite thing. And I use Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 flour, and it makes a really delicious crepe. So there are many things you can do with grains that are gluten-free. And there's more than I just mentioned. But it does not mean that you will not be able to eat grains again. There's still an abundance for you. Okay, next slide. And there's these are just two of cookbooks, but I have so many. I should have brought them to this table right now and held them up in front of you. I almost wrote my own gluten-free cookbook because I was having so much fun discovering how to make, gluten-free muffins and crepes and different meals, my oat burger patties, and different sauces and things that you can, the gluten-free pastas that I do use. But, there's already enough cookbooks out there that I felt like, why should I make one too? They're making their own cookbooks out there, and there's so many. You go and you can find, there's a beautiful plant-based cookbook from California, and that I would hold it up and recommend it to you. I'd have to go grab it. Maybe I will at the end. But there are many wonderful, and many of them are plant-based. They're even dairy-free, and they're gluten-free. So some people are not ready to go to that extent of being dairy-free, gluten-free, vegan. But it's not difficult if you have a good cookbook, and if you're willing to experiment and you're longing to be healthy and as healthy as you can be without denying yourself of proper nutrition, because we don't want to turn people into anorexics who are afraid to eat. That isn't healthy at all. So just remember, you want to eat an abundance and a variety of the natural plant-based foods. Okay, next slide. Again, I found this one online, and it's a really nice picture of the villi. You can see how those like finger-like projections are everything that take from what you've eaten and bring it into the blood system. So you're absorbing your food through this fine mechanism. God created us in ways that are amazing. In our whole life, we can never fully understand all the wondrous ways that God created us. But our small intestine itself is a beautiful creation, the way that it's designed to absorb our food. Okay, the next. However, if you have celiac, look, your villi become so flattened, you don't even see those little finger-like projections. Some people say that your intestine looks like a scalloped picture. It's flat and wavy, but it doesn't have those fingers. So let's look at the next slide. And that's what it should look like. What a difference. Okay, that's a healthy villi. So those are just a few of my slides. I actually can't find a presentation that I did about 10 years ago that I'll need to put together again. But in my presentation that I had, it talks about all the kinds of ailments that you get from having celiac disease. So you can have joint pain, you can have brain fog, you can have autoimmune things, you can have connective tissue disorder. Of course, many people are finding that children, schizophrenia, people who have been labeled as schizophrenic need to be gluten-free because that may be affecting their brain. They've taken children with ADD and ADHD and autistic children, and there are many experiments on diet with them, and there are many that go gluten-free in order to help them with their brain development. So I just find that fascinating that, you have symptoms in your body that tell you something isn't quite right. And you can ignore it for years and go, oh, maybe that's just normal. Stomach aches are normal. Or brain fog, oh, well, I don't know, maybe I'll just drink coffee. But that isn't normal. What's normal is our healing journey, is recognizing that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that God absolutely created us to be healthy. There's a scripture that says, I wish above all things you would prosper and be in health, even as your soul prospers. So we know we live in a land that's foreign to what is good health. And then we must seek it out and teach each other. And in my presentations about 10 years ago, I started to do a slideshow. Wish I could find that one for you and maybe next time. But I did the slideshow, which showed many of the slides you just saw. And as well as that, I talked and demonstrated gluten-free food. So we had a gluten-free local pizza man come in and share the pizza that he had created. And then I made a few gluten-free dishes for them to try and some lovely vegetable meals too. And everybody loved it. And so it's a very interesting outreach. But I think that the more that we're educating one another, the better we are at avoiding other issues. So, like I said, a non-diagnosed celiac person could end up with cancer, and usually it's a stomach cancer. But when it's diagnosed and caught in time, praise God, you can keep that person healthy for many, many years. So at this point, if I was in a live interaction, I'd say, are there any questions? And I would take questions, and I'd love to do that. When I talk on Zoom, I like to do that. There's one thing I want to share with you, and that is that one of the hardest things of having a gluten allergy, or it's not an allergy, but having this problem, is that someone by mistake wants to give you something and you eat it out of, you're grateful that they gave you some food. Well, my neighbor has a gluten-free pizza, and he brought it over every week, and we ate with him. But one day, by mistake, he gave us 2 pizzas, and one was not gluten-free, and it was in the same kind of box, and I ate it. And I'm telling you this because I was really sick. Like, I thought I was having a gluten-free pizza, and I had one slice of it, and I was like, this is so good. It tastes really good. And then 20 minutes later, I was in extreme pain, and I was vomiting all night. What did I learn from that? Well, I learned to have things in my house that will protect me from having severe, somehow you feel like you have to go back to day one and start all over again when you've been attacked and you have that inflammation. But because there is wisdom and because there are remedies, you don't have to go to day one. What I was able to do is to take charcoal tablets. Everyone should have charcoal at home in case you get toxins in your body that you didn't plan on. And I did the charcoal. And then the next day, I took something called gluten guard, which is an enzyme. And that helped my body to break it down. And then I started on some very good quality probiotics. And I had to build up my gut from all of that. It could have taken like months to get back the health, but it didn't because of these 3 things. So anyone who has to deal with gluten-free and discover it and change your whole life like I did, have these 3 things on hand as well. Have charcoal, have an enzyme, and also have a good probiotic. So that is my gluten-free story, and I want to thank you for taking time to look at it, to consider it, and to know that if you are having any health issues, do consider making a diet change. But if you're going to go off of gluten, don't do it. I know that sounds weird, right? Don't do it until you've been tested. If you go off of gluten and then you get tested, it will be a false test. The only way to have an accurate test is to be eating gluten, and then they'll test you, and then they'll know if you're reacting. Okay? So it's the best advice I can give is to get a test and also find out if there's anyone in your family, because they have now discovered that this is a genetic disease, and it's something that cannot always be seen right away, but it comes through one of your parents, maybe both. So in a way, that's good news, because because our knowledge, what is it, forearmed? If we have this knowledge, and if I can share this knowledge with you, maybe many of you won't have any of the discomfort and the suffering that a person can have with celiac. You can avoid it. And I want to thank you for taking time, and I'll see you again. Please send your questions in, and I can happily connect with you. Okay, take care.